The courtroom was quiet. You could almost hear the hum of the overhead lights. People sat still in the wooden benches, some whispering softly, others just waiting. Judge Eleanor Hayes entered with steady steps. Her black robe flowed as she walked. Her face looked calm, but her eyes searched the room like she was already thinking deeply. She had been a judge for years. She'd seen hundreds of cases, some strange, some sad, some full of anger. But this day felt different. Something in the air was heavy. She looked at the file in her hand. A criminal case. A serious one. A man accused of theft, deception, and trespassing. The kind of charges that could ruin a person's life. She glanced at the name on the paper. Her hand froze. She blinked once, then twice. Her breath caught in her chest. The name wasn't just familiar. It was part of her childhood. The courtroom door opened, and a man was brought in. He wore plain clothes, an old brown jacket, a hand-stitched shirt, and black suspenders. His beard was full but neat. His eyes were kind, yet tired. His boots tapped the floor softly as he walked toward the defendant's seat. Judge Hayes felt her heart drop. She knew him. He was her childhood best friend. They used to run in fields together, laugh by the riverside, and share secrets under the tall oak tree behind the village church. She hadn't seen him in over 20 years, and now here he was, on trial. In her courtroom, the air felt tighter. The lawyer stood and began to speak, explaining the charges. The man, her old friend, sat quietly, hands folded. His eyes didn't wander. He didn't even look at her yet. Judge Hayes had handled tough trials before, but this was something else. Memories came rushing back. The smell of fresh bread in his mother's kitchen. The way they used to talk about the stars. The day he said goodbye to go back to the Amish life while she stayed in the city. Now he sat accused of a crime that could destroy him. Her thoughts raced. How could this happen? What brought him here? What secrets were buried beneath this quiet man's face? She looked up again. His eyes met hers. And just like that, the past slammed into the present. Loud, messy, and full of questions. For a moment, the courtroom disappeared. Judge Hayes was no longer standing in her black robe. In her mind, she was 12 again, barefoot in the summer grass, laughing with a boy who wore a wide straw hat and always smelled like hay. His name didn't matter right now. What mattered was that back then, he had been her safe place. Now he was the defendant. She blinked and cleared her throat. She couldn't let her thoughts control her. She was a judge. This was a real case, not a memory. The trial began. The prosecutor stepped forward. He wore a shiny gray suit and a sharp voice. "Your Honor," he began, "the man before you trespassed on private land late one night. He broke into a barn that didn't belong to him. He took farming tools, expensive ones, and he left behind tracks. We have proof, footprints, a broken fence, and neighbors who heard him." The courtroom stayed still. All eyes were on the Amish man, sitting quietly. Judge Hayes nodded. "Continue." The defense lawyer stood up next. She was younger, a little nervous. "Your Honor, my client did walk onto that land, but he didn't break in. He didn't steal. He was trying to help. There had been a storm. Animals were loose. The barn door was already broken. He saw danger. He stepped in. Some people in the courtroom made small sounds, half gasps, half scoffs. Judge Hayes looked at the Amish man again. He was still quiet. His hands rested gently in his lap. His shoulders were wide but relaxed. His eyes looked calm, not scared. He wasn't fidgeting. He wasn't angry. She remembered that look. He always used to sit that way when someone was hurt or upset. Calm, still, like a rock in a river. "Let the defendant speak," she said softly. He stood slowly. His voice was deep, kind, and full of something old. Something peaceful. "I did go there," he said. "The storm had knocked the fence down. Cows were out. I didn't want them to get lost or hit. I picked up the tools, but I didn't steal them. I used them to fix what I could. I left them by the door when I was done. The room was silent. Judge Hayes leaned back. Her mind turned in circles. His words sounded true. Simple, honest. But the law needed proof, not feelings. She looked down at the papers again. "There are witnesses?" she asked. The prosecutor nodded. "Yes." A neighbor saw him leave. Another said he looked suspicious. The owner of the farm claims nothing was borrowed, only stolen. Judge Hayes stared at the papers. This was going to be harder than she thought, and something deep in her chest whispered that the real story hadn't even begun. The next morning, the courtroom filled up faster than usual. Word had spread. A respected Amish man was on trial. And not just any man, but someone known to a few older folks as that quiet boy from years ago. People whispered about his kind nature, about how he helped anyone who asked, about how he never owned much, but always gave plenty. Judge Hayes sat straight in her chair. She had barely slept. Her mind kept going back. Memories of their childhood, the moments they shared, and the paths they chose. She had gone off to college. He had gone back to the Amish way, and life had built thick walls between them. Now those walls were cracking. The witness was called to the stand. It was the farmer whose land had been broken into, a man with sharp eyes and a bitter tone. "I saw the fence," the farmer said. "It was cut, not broken by wind, cut clean through. That man," he pointed, "was walking out with a saw and a hammer." "My hammer," the courtroom murmured. Judge Hayes raised her hand. "Order, please." The defense lawyer stood. "Sir, is it possible the wind could have caused the damage?" The farmer laughed coldly. "You think I don't know the difference? I've been farming this land for 40 years. And did you see him take the tools? I saw him leaving with them. Did he run? No. Did he try to hide? No. Did you ever ask him why he was there?" The farmer paused. "No," he said finally. Judge Hayes leaned forward. "And when you reported it, did you check to see if anything was actually missing?" The man's mouth tightened. "I was angry. I didn't check until later." "And was anything gone?" she asked again. He shifted uncomfortably. "No." The room grew quiet again. That was the moment things started to change. Judge Hayes looked down. Her pen tapped the desk slowly. She saw the holes in the story forming. Still, there were more questions, more things hidden. During the break, she walked outside the courtroom into the hallway. Fresh air, quiet walls, a chance to think. She leaned against the window, looking down at the street. And then she heard it, a voice behind her. "I didn't expect to see you again like this." She turned. It was him, not as a defendant, not as a stranger, just as the boy she once knew. She didn't answer at first. "I didn't expect it either," she said softly. He looked tired. "I didn't take anything. I swear." She nodded. "I know." And in that moment, she realized this case wasn't just about a fence or a tool. It was about something much deeper. The roots of trust, the walls of class, the quiet lives we forget until they walk back into our lives. The trial moved forward. Next witness, another neighbor, a man in his 60s. He had known the Amish defendant for years. His tone was more cautious than angry. "I saw him walking toward the barn that night," the neighbor said. "It was raining. I was closing my windows. I figured he was helping. That's the kind of man he's always been." The prosecutor frowned. "But you didn't see him inside the barn, correct?" "No, sir. But I also didn't hear any loud noises. No sign of force. No trouble. Just quiet footsteps. And in the morning, the cows were back inside." That last part caught Judge Hayes' attention. The cows were back inside. Someone had cared enough to bring them back. She wrote that down. The defense lawyer asked gently, "Would you say the defendant is trustworthy?" "Yes, absolutely." Judge Hayes looked over at the Amish man again. He still hadn't changed his posture. He sat like a man used to silence, like someone who spent most of his life listening instead of speaking. She wondered how many times people had spoken for him, or about him without really knowing him. The prosecutor brought in one last surprise. A police officer. He took the stand and shared what he found the night the report was made. There were no fingerprints, he said. No signs of damage inside the barn. Tools were neatly placed near the door. But since the landowner filed charges, we had to bring the man in. Was he cooperative? Judge Hayes asked. Yes, Your Honor. He came willingly. Answered every question. Did he seem confused? Angry? No, just quiet. Judge Hayes sighed silently. The facts were not adding up the way the prosecutor wanted. There was no clear crime, just suspicion. And now her old friend sat there, his whole life paused because someone misunderstood his actions, or maybe feared him for being different. She turned slightly and looked at the faces in the courtroom. Some looked tired, others were just bored, but a few looked angry, uncomfortable, like they didn't like seeing a man in simple clothes treated with respect. Privilege, she thought, doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears a suit and thinks it knows the truth before hearing the story. Her gaze returned to the man she once played with by the river. He looked up. Their eyes met again. He didn't smile, but she felt a soft warmth pass between them, like an old friendship knocking on the door of justice. As the trial pushed into the third day, the weight in the courtroom grew heavier. Judge Hayes noticed the tension in people's shoulders. Even the lawyers, once firm in tone, had grown slower, more careful. Something about this case was cutting deeper than just laws and rules. It was touching nerves, personal ones, old beliefs, quiet bias, hidden assumptions. The defense called their final witness, an older woman in a blue headscarf. She looked humble, gentle, but strong. She walked to the witness box with slow steps, holding a small Bible in her hand. Ma'am, the defense said softly, how do you know the defendant? He's my neighbor. Been so for over 15 years, she said, voice quiet but steady. When my husband died, he came over every Sunday with eggs. Helped fix my fence. Never asked for a thing. And the night in question, I saw him walking toward the farm. I asked where he was headed. He said he heard some animals crying. He looked worried. I offered him my flashlight. She smiled slightly. He said he didn't want to wake the farmer, but couldn't let the animals suffer. The courtroom stayed still again. Judge Hayes noticed people shifting in their seats. Truth was doing something here, cutting through the noise, touching hearts. The prosecutor stood up, but even his voice had lost its bite. Did you see him fix the fence? He asked. No, she said. But in the morning, I saw the cows were back. Fence had rope tied tight where it was loose. That was his rope. He's used it to fix my coop before. The prosecutor nodded and sat down. No more questions. Judge Hayes looked down at the file again. The charges, trespassing, theft, mischief. And yet, not a single witness had seen him act in harm. No damage, no loss, just quiet work, quiet hands, quiet help. She remembered something her father used to say back in their village. Goodness doesn't shout. It works while the world sleeps. She glanced toward the Amish man again. Still calm. Still. What had the system done? She thought, was this really about justice? Or just fear wrapped in law? When court paused for lunch, Judge Hayes sat alone in her chamber. She placed her hand on the file. Her fingers traced the cover. She thought about their childhood again. They used to talk about growing up and changing the world, but only one of them had been allowed to. She became a judge. He remained quiet in the fields. And yet now, he was the one being judged by a world that didn't understand the quiet way. That afternoon, the courtroom felt different. More reporters had shown up. Word had spread online. Amish man on trial for helping. Some called injustice. Others said the system was doing its job. But Judge Hayes knew one thing clearly now. This case had grown larger than the fence, the tools, or even the man himself. It had become a mirror. People were starting to look at themselves. The prosecutor, more cautious now, stood to make closing remarks. "Your Honor," he began, "we don't deny the defendant may have meant well. But law is law. He trespassed. He touched property that wasn't his. He didn't ask for permission. No matter how kind someone may be, if we allow people to break into barns, even for good reasons, we blur the lines of what's right and what's wrong." He paused. The law doesn't judge feelings. It judges facts. Then he sat. Judge Hayes turned to the defense. The young lawyer stood slowly, clutching her notes, but spoke from the heart. "Your Honor, the law is here to protect people, but sometimes it must also protect goodness. This man didn't steal. He didn't harm. He helped, quietly, without asking for thanks. He thought of the animals. He fixed a fence. He brought tools back." She stepped closer to the bench. "This is not about crime. This is about misunderstanding, about how the world treats someone who looks different, lives different, loves quiet instead of noise." Then she ended softly. "If justice cannot see the difference between harm and help, then maybe justice needs to look closer." Judge Hayes sat in silence. The room waited. She gave a small nod. "Court is adjourned until the verdict is ready." She stepped away and walked into her chambers, closing the door behind her. The walls felt too tight. She pulled off her robe, sat at her desk, and closed her eyes. Memories flooded in. There were kids again, running through cornfields, chasing chickens, laughing under stars. He had once saved her from falling into the river. Now, she wondered if it was her turn to save him. But the law wasn't feelings. She couldn't decide based only on childhood. She had to decide based on truth. So she opened the file one last time. Read every line again. No damage, no theft, no intent to harm, no gain for himself. Just rope, a flashlight, a man doing what he thought was right while the world slept. She picked up her pen. Her hand didn't shake. It wrote the verdict in slow, careful strokes. The next morning, the courtroom was full. Not a single seat was empty. People stood along the back wall. Some were locals. Others were strangers who had read about the trial. A few carried small notebooks, ready to scribble every word. Everyone wanted to know, what would the judge decide? Judge Hayes entered slowly, robe brushing the floor. Her face calm, eyes steady. But inside, her chest felt like thunder. She sat down, looked at the papers before her, then raised her eyes to the man she once knew as a barefoot boy chasing frogs by the pond. He looked back, still calm, still trusting, and something about that look gave her the strength to speak. "This court has reviewed all evidence," she began, voice strong but gentle. "There are facts, and there is context. The law requires both." She paused. While it is true the defendant stepped on a land that was not his, it is also clear he did not act with harm or personal gain. No property was damaged. No tools were taken. In fact, animals were returned to safety. Fences were mended. Tools were left behind. Her voice softened slightly. "This court sees not a thief, but a neighbor. Not a criminal, but a man who helped when help was needed." She took a breath. "And so, I find the defendant not guilty." A wave of sound moved through the room. Soft gasps, a few quiet cheers. Some people just sat in silence, stunned. The Amish man did not smile. He only closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again, nodded once, and folded his hands. Still calm, still quiet, still him. Judge Hayes stood up. Court dismissed, but no one moved at first. Then the crowd began to shuffle out, some whispering to each other, others looking toward the man like they saw him with new eyes. He remained seated, waiting. Finally, after most had gone, he stood, walked toward the front, stopped just in front of the bench. He looked up at her, and finally spoke. "Thank you." She shook her head slightly. "You were always good. I just had to remember." They stood in silence. Years between them. 100 stories unspoken, but no need for them all now. Some friendships survive in quiet, like seeds under snow, waiting for spring. Outside the courthouse, the sky had softened. Clouds stretched lazily across the pale morning sun. The air smelled like fresh earth, like it had just rained, even though it hadn't. People stood in small groups, talking about what had happened inside. But the Amish man didn't stay for the chatter. He walked down the courthouse steps alone, his boots clicking softly on the concrete. He carried nothing but the same calm he'd walked in with. Judge Hayes watched him through the window of her chambers. Something tugged at her heart. Without thinking, she stepped outside. He was halfway down the street when she called out quietly, "Wait." He stopped and turned. No surprise in his face, just a small tilt of the head, like he'd known she'd follow eventually. She caught up to him. For a while, they just walked together. No destination, just two old friends walking in silence like they had done many years ago when the world was simpler. "You never left," she said finally. "No," he replied. "The world left me." She looked down. "I'll let it leave you too." He stopped near a small bench by a tree. "Life took us different ways," he said. "Doesn't mean I was forgotten." She sat down beside him. "I forgot the way you see the world," she admitted. "Everything loud these days. Rushed. But you move like time doesn't matter." He smiled softly. "It matters, but not more than peace." They sat for a while longer. She asked, "Why didn't you defend yourself harder? Why stay so silent?" He looked out toward the road. "Because truth speaks better when it's not shouted," he said. And suddenly, she understood something deeper than the case, deeper than the law. He hadn't been on trial alone. The system had been. People had seen him. Quiet, simple kind. And they had rushed to label, to accuse. Because they didn't understand a man who lived without noise. A man who helped without wanting credit. But now maybe they would see things differently. She stood. He did too. "If you ever need anything," she started. He nodded gently. "I know." Then he turned and walked away. No farewell, no goodbye, just the steady steps of a man who never changed, even when the world tried to make him. The case became a quiet headline. A few blogs wrote about it. Judge clears Amish man in unusual trial. Silent kindness wins. But soon, the world moved on. New stories, louder stories, took over. The courthouse returned to normal rhythms. But in the small village where the Amish man lived, something had changed. People who once waved politely from a distance now stopped to talk. A young boy rode past on a bicycle and called out, "You're the one from the news." The man just nodded and smiled. Elders came by with pies, tools, seeds, offering thanks for a truth that had once been hidden but now was clear. Still, he didn't say much. He rose at dawn, milked his cows, fixed fences, helped neighbors when asked, just as he always had. But now people noticed. Even the farmer who once accused him passed by his gate one afternoon. He didn't say much, just stood there with a hat in his hands, shifting from foot to foot. "I might have gotten it wrong," he mumbled. The Amish man didn't answer. He just opened the gate. The farmer stepped through, quiet and awkward, and they worked together, fixing a broken post by the path. No apology needed, just shared work, shared peace. Back in the city, Judge Hayes sat in her chambers after a long day. A letter lay on her desk. No return address, just plain paper, handwritten. Inside were only a few words. "Thank you for seeing me." She smiled. Sometimes justice wasn't about shouting or punishing. Sometimes it was about remembering that every person carries a story behind their silence. She folded the letter and placed it in her drawer. There were still many more cases to hear, many more people to face. But she would listen differently now. Because one quiet man had reminded her that truth doesn't always wear a badge or speak through a lawyer. Sometimes truth walks barefoot, quiet, with eyes that see past fear and hearts that choose to help, even when no one is looking. It was early spring. In the village, the earth had begun to wake. Green shoots pushed up through soil that had once been frozen solid. Trees wore buds like promises. Birds returned to nest where they'd once sung in the silence. The Amish man walked along the field path at dawn, lantern in hand. His boots pressed gently into the soft ground. The air smelled like fresh hay and hope. Children ran by on the way to school. One boy stopped and looked up at him. "My teacher told us about you," he said. "She said you were brave." The man smiled, kneeling to tie the boy's untied shoe. "Being brave doesn't always mean fighting," he whispered. "Sometimes it just means standing still when everyone else runs." The boy nodded, then ran to catch up with his friends. Behind the barn, the fence still had the rope he had used that stormy night. He never took it down. It stood as a quiet reminder of what had passed. He didn't speak about the trial, not to his family, not to the other farmers. It had come and gone like a cold wind, uncomfortable but temporary. But others remembered. Young men began asking him for advice on how to mend, how to build, how to stay calm when things felt unfair. He didn't say much, just taught by doing. That was his way. One evening, long after the sun had gone down, a black car pulled up near the edge of the village. Out stepped Judge Hayes. No robe, no papers, just jeans and an old jacket. She walked the gravel path to his gate. He was waiting on the porch with 2 wooden chairs. "Thought you might come back one day," he said. "I needed the quiet," she replied. They sat, the stars above them soft and silent. "I've heard things are different here now," she said after a while. "They listen more," he replied, "and I don't have to speak louder to be heard." She nodded slowly. "That's something rare." He looked up. "You made it happen." "No," she whispered. "You did. I just finally saw it." They didn't talk much more. They didn't need to. 2 old friends. 2 lives shaped by choices. In a quiet moment where justice didn't wear armor, but peace. Some stories are not loud. Some heroes don't wear capes. Some trials change more than a name in a file. They change the way a village sees a man and how a judge sees the world.